Hello, welcome to this course on mastering CSS layouts using design patterns. I am Travis Waith-Mair. I am the creator of the Bedrock Layout Primitives Library, and I've spent years honing my skills grappling with challenges of web layout design. Today, I am thrilled to guide you through a learning experience that goes beyond just syntax and properties and teaches practical solutions to everyday problems. Have you ever felt confined by the rigid structure of Bootstrap's 12-column grid system? Or found yourself throwing metaphorical mud at the wall hoping that your layout will stick? You're not alone. For years, I shared this same struggle, uncertain which combinations of properties was essential to achieve the perfect layout. That is until I discovered the power of design patterns. In this course, we will break free from the constraints of CSS frameworks and delve into design patterns. No longer will you feel bound by predefined grids, and instead you'll learn to think in patterns like stacks, splits, or inline clusters. My goal is to equip you with the confidence to tackle any layout challenge armed with real practical solutions. Design patterns are the key to unlocking intentional web layouts. They help you focus on problems and provide solutions tailored to those challenges. Throughout the course, we'll explore these patterns, initially using CSS Grid syntax, and then later transitioning into CSS Flexbox. You'll recognize layout problems and instinctively know which design patterns are best suited to solve them. Armed with this knowledge, you'll be adept at implementing these patterns, equipped with tools to conquer everyday challenges encountered in web layouts. So, what is a design pattern? A design pattern, one of the earliest examples of this comes from this book, A Pattern Language. And in this book, the authors introduce patterns that are used to solve common problems that people face when designing towns, designing buildings, and even designing individual homes or rooms. This is a quote from the book. They say, each solution is stated in such a way that it gives the essential field of relationship needed to solve the problem, but in a very general and abstract way. So you can solve the problem in your way by adapting it to your preferences and to the local conditions that place you are making it. So in layman's terms, basically a design pattern is a general, reusable solution to a commonly occurring problem. A design pattern is not the actual implementation itself. It is in fact a description or a template for how to solve a problem that can be used in many different situations. Now this concept was brought over and adapted into software engineering. One of the most famous books that did this is this book called Design Patterns for Elements of Reusable Object-Oriented Software, written by 4 authors. Oftentimes this is called the Gang of 4. And they introduce several patterns of software in this exact way. So for example, they introduce this concept of a decorator pattern, and then they would give examples on how to implement this. Now you notice here, there's no code here. This is just high-level templates. That way it can be adapted into whatever code and implementation that fits their need. So why are design patterns useful? Well, they create a systematic approach to solving recurring challenges. They promote modular and reusable code base, and they encourage efficient and maintainable code. This is especially helpful in CSS layout because without it, we just start throwing mud on the wall and we just start getting things to work, but we don't really understand why we're doing certain things or another. So we're going to introduce in this course 7 design patterns that will help you recognize problems and the solutions that solve those problems. And specifically, we're going to talk about the stack, the inline cluster, the split, the cover, the center, the column drop, and the grid design pattern. So I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, the stack design pattern is for when you have a set of elements that you want to stack on top of each other. Pretty simple, right? So here's a couple examples I found in the wild. You can see here we have a set of elements that are stacked on top of each other. And then we have this element stacked on top of just this stack of elements. So you can see that these things can be composed within each other. And this is going to be true for all of the design patterns. Here's another example. We have these 2 items are stacked on each other. Then we have this stack stacked on top of this, stacked on top of this. We have these elements stacked on top of each other. Then this whole thing, we have this group of things stacked on top of this group of things. Okay, this is the thing that we're going to be building in the rest of this modules. Now, we're not going to get into how we're going to build it right now. First, I just want you to look at this application, this landing page, and identify stacks. I'm going to scroll through here and give you a chance to look at them. I'm also going to provide a PDF of this in the lesson. What I want you to do is pause the video, scroll back, look through all that, and then decide what elements you think are stacks. And I'll be right back. Okay, welcome back. So here are a few of the stacks that I identified. We have these things are stacked on top of each other. We have these things are stacked, this stacked on top of this content. We have this thing stacked on top of this, and then these are stacked on top of each other. And then we have a bunch of grid items here that are stacked on top of each other. Each one of these footer elements are stacked on top of each other. So you can see what really defines a stack and what defines when you need a new stack is when the space in between the elements need to change. So you can see here, these things is one stack, but we have a stack within a stack because the space here is not the same as the space here. So this needs to be its own stack, while this becomes a different stack. And the same here. This is a stack, this is a stack, but then these elements are stacked uniquely on top of each other because they have a different spacing requirement than here. That's the stack pattern. We'll go on to the next pattern in the next lesson. This lesson, we're going to talk about the inline cluster design pattern. Now, the problem that we're trying to solve with the inline cluster design pattern is when we have a set of elements that need to be displayed inline, but wrapped to a new line when they exceed the available space. An example of this is when we have these elements, but we can no longer fit like this vocabulary inline, it will wrap around to a new line. If we go look at this page at a full desktop size, it would be over here. When we have less space, it will wrap underneath. And then you see inside of this community wraps to the next row. It's all about trying to put things in line, but wrapping when we have no more available space. Let's go ahead and go back to the application. And I want you to identify things that are in line and that take advantage of this inline cluster. So we have a few things here. We have this toolbar is obviously inline, but also the individual aspects of them are inline clusters. And then we have the footer here. Each column here is actually inline. So not really technically a column, but they're actually just inline. And then we have this bottom footer, which is inline. So that's the inline cluster design pattern. A split design pattern is when you have two elements that need to be displayed side by side. We have here an example I found in the wild. We have this item next to this item. We have, in this case, this avatar next to the main content right here. And we also have this main section with a sidebar. So sometimes people will call it a sidebar, sometimes people will call it different things, but the idea is that it's a split component. It's a split pattern where one thing is next to another. And once again, we have another example of a main content and a sidebar. Let's go back to our application. I'm going to scroll through here, and I want you to identify examples of the split pattern in use here. Okay, so we have two examples on this page that we're looking at. We have this panel next to this panel. So that's an example of a split design pattern. And then same thing here. We have this group of content next to this group of content. So that's some examples of the split design pattern. The covered design pattern is when you have an element that needs to fill the available space, specifically in the vertical or the block direction. And then you want to center the content, once again, vertically centering in the block direction. So here's an example. We have this box is taking up the entire container, and then the contents is centered vertically. We have it taking up content in the vertical direction, and the contents are centered vertically. Now, just to be clear, you could have things that are up at the top and the bottom of this, but the main thing is that it's taking up the entire column, and then there's content inside centered vertically. Let's come back to our application here. And I want you to look for examples of where we are taking up content vertically and centering its content vertically inside of there. So we'll scroll through here just to get a chance to look through that. Pause the video, take a look, and then we'll be right back. We have two examples of vertically centered content, and that's these two panels. So this whole thing is a split pattern, but individually each panel is an example of a cover pattern. So that's the cover pattern. Now the center design pattern is when you have an element that needs to stop growing horizontally or in the inline direction, and you want to center its content in that inline direction. So here we have an example of content that stopped growing at a certain width and centered inside the parent container. This one maybe is a little less obvious because the screenshot cut out this line here on the slides, but we have this content stop growing even though the parent container is continuing to grow, and the content is centered inside of this parent container. So let's go through this example application again, and I want you to identify examples of centered content. Okay, so this may have been one that a lot of people miss, but this entire application is actually centered. It's in a center content because you see the parent container, which in this case is the body of the page, has continued to grow to take the entire width, but the content itself stopped growing at a particular size and centered itself. So this whole thing is in a center component. We have this area. This is centered. So this box stopped growing and is centered. We have this box is centered. This box is a centered component, but it's still taking up the entire width because it hasn't grown yet to the point where it would center. So even though it is still taking up the entire width, that doesn't mean it isn't being used as a center component. But yeah, we have this item, and then this might be considered centered, but the reason it's not is because it's already an inline component, and we're just justifying the content center. So this is actually clustering in the center, and that's why it is not a center component. So these are examples of the center pattern in use. Now, the column drop is when we have a set of elements that need to be displayed in even columns, but when we run out of room in the inline direction, we want it to wrap to a new row. Now in each row, the column count will be independent from the previous row above it. As you can see here, we have 5 items of content. 3 of the items can fit on one row, so we have 3 equal columns. But on the next row, since we only have 2 items, we only have 2 columns. As we drop to a new row, the columns become independent of the row above it. Hence, that's why it's called the column drop component. Here's an example in the wild. You see here that we have each one of these avatars are taking up a unique set of columns on different rows that they're on. Now, in this case, each column is not taking up the entire width. They're only taking up their individual space. They're not centered inside this content. But this is still a variation of that concept of a column drop. So let's go to our example page. We'll scroll through here. And then I want you to identify examples of the column drop pattern. So in this application, we have this right here, this little box. And this is an example of the column drop pattern in use. And in this case, this is the only example. I want you to keep an eye out for this in your web searching as you go online. and notice it. And we're going to talk about one more design pattern in the next lesson. We're going to talk about our final design pattern in this lesson, and that's called the grid design pattern. Now, the grid design pattern is when you have a set of elements that need to be displayed in even columns and then wrapped to a new row when there's no more available space. Now, unlike the column drop component, we want that column count to be consistent across rows. If this was the column drop component, we would have 2 columns of equal amount. But in this case, we have 3 columns still, but because we only have 2 elements, this third column remains empty. So I found this in the wild. This is an example of the grid pattern in use. We have equal columns, but because we don't have enough items for this final column, it will remain empty. So let's go back to our example applications. I'm scrolling through here so you can get a look at that. And I want you to pause the video, look and identify grid pattern in use, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. So example of how the grid pattern is being used is this section right here. We have these items that are in a grid, and they're taking up even amount of columns. But if we were missing content for this section right here, this would have stayed empty. So that's the design patterns. This course is divided into 4 sections, each building on the previous one. First, you'll grasp the essence of design patterns and familiarize yourself with the common problems and solutions to these problems. Then we'll dive into practical implementations of these patterns using both CSS Grid and CSS Flexbox. Finally, in the 4th section, we'll explore which implementations tend to work best, as well as some other patterns that we use in web layouts that complement the design pattern way of thinking. This will provide you with a holistic understanding of effective web layout strategies.
Thanks for watching. If you want to keep learning, click the link in the description below.